So, good morning everybody again. So I guess my main goal for this talk is not to go very deep in any specific weed management recommendation. It's kind of to give you a broad overview about some of the most important things to think about weed management, weed science, and what are the important things to pay attention when you are planning your weed management program, and then the importance of proper weed identification, and then what are the weed control options that we have, some of the tools available. So basically that's kind of the main topics that I was planning to cover today. Since it's my very first time meeting you guys, I thought it would be interesting to very briefly, just one slide, talk a little bit about my background, and then go over some of those topics, what is technically, what we consider a weed, and why it's important to know the different types of weed and the different weed classification, and why do we care so much about weeds, what are the main problems and challenges, and then the importance of proper weed ID, some of the tools that we have available to us that will help us to properly identify our weeds and therefore choose the proper management tools, and finally some of those management tools and the difference between them and the difference efficacy that each one might have depending on the weed types that we have, and also some best management practices that we should consider every time we are putting together a weed management program. Think about the long-term sustainability of our tools and herbicide resistance and all those things. So basically, I don't know if you guys were wondering about the accent, but I'm originally from Brazil. And I got my bachelor's in agronomy, and even though I did not grow up on a farm, my mom grew up on a farm, and my brother and I, we would have our summer breaks in that farm. And since the pandemic started, my brother actually moved back to the farm, and now he's trying to become a farmer. He planted soybean for the first time, and now he's planting sorghum. He doesn't want to keep working for industry, and he doesn't want to keep his job and having all the bosses. He wants to become a full-time farmer in the near future, and I hope that happens too. So basically my history of our background in weed science started back in 2015. I had the chance to go to the University of Florida, which is this picture here, where I was mainly developing very applied weed science research, working with trying to investigate and identify integrated weed management strategies to control a perennial warm season grass that we have there. It's called mudgrass. It is an invasive from Asia, and it is the most problematic weed that we have in our pastures, particularly our improved pastures, but in Florida it's bahia grass. And after that I had a chance to go to a much colder place. I had 1.5 years I did a postdoc at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And that was, even though I didn't like the winter, and that was my main reason why I didn't want to stay there, but it was a very nice experience because I had the chance to work with alfalfa, some cool season grasses for their pastures there, clovers, and here in this picture, silage corn. And this picture on the top is still in Brazil. That's when I got my master's. I was working with herbicide safety and efficacy in sugarcane, which is one of our main crops in São Paulo, which is the state that I'm from. And then finally, before joining the UFA, I was a farm advisor with the University of California Cooperative and Extension. I was based in the northern San Joaquin Valley, so I was a field crops, agronomy and weed management advisor, and mainly covering cotton, alfalfa, small grains, dry beans, and even safflower I had the chance to see for the first time. So let's going back to our main presentation. So what is a weed? So the definition of a weed, it can be very subjective, and if it wasn't for humans, there will not be weeds, because basically weeds, the way that I like to see, and probably one of the easiest ways to understand, is simply a plant out of place or an undesirable plant. And what I mean by undesirable is that for some reason it's called initials for a human-related activity. So, for example, let's think about these first two pictures. We have a scouring rush in a soybean field, and then the same plant being used as an ornamental. So in this case, this is a weed because our main plant here, the desirable plant that we want is our soybean, and now every single other plant that is growing there It's competing with your crop, and then therefore it's a plant out of place. But in this case, I wouldn't consider the same plant as a weed. So it's all about it's all about a matter of whether or not it's being causing issues for something related to human activity. Another example is corn. We call volunteer corn growing in a soybean field. So in this case, even though corn is one of the most widely planted crops and most important crops in the US, in the world, in this particular scenario it is a weed because it is competing for resource for our main species. And the other thing about weeds is that they tend to be very successful in colonizing areas and being able to establish and expand by themselves without any further help from humans. And also, another common trait for pretty much almost all weeds, they tend to be very successful plants because they normally are very prolific seed producers, like Russ briefly was mentioning. They have the ability to establish and reproduce very successfully without humans' help, and it tends to be very competitive. In most cases, they will outcompete our crops. And so, with that being said, even though the term weeds can be somewhat subjective, there are some things that are in terms of classification of the weeds, that they are very straightforward and they are important because they will be very important for us to help to plan how we will control those weeds. So when you think about weed classification, there are a couple of main groups. The first one that I like to say is classifying weeds based on their growth forms. So basically what I'm talking about here is whether or not we have a broadleaf weed or a grass weed or a sedge. So the broadleaf weeds, which are here in the US very common, and when you think about our large acreage crops, most of the most problematic weeds, they are broadleaf weeds. In Brazil it's a little bit different, we struggle a little bit more with our grasses. But basically, the key features that we should pay attention in order to call a plant a broadleaf is the first thing is that as they emerge, they have two cotyledon leaves, so that's why we call them dicots. The grasses they will have just one, so they are monocots. And then all the other more, commonly that are very straightforward. The leaf shape is very different. They have very wide leaf shapes, and the veins, differently than the grasses, they are not parallel to the midvein. They are smaller veins, and they tend to be more branched or net-like. Just a few examples of broadleaf weeds, chickweed, a winter annual, and then I'm going to talk about life cycles later. Pigweed. Pigweed species, we have palmer amaranth, smooth pigweed, redroot pigweed, spine pigweed. They are a major problem in not only Arizona but throughout the entire US, and particularly palmer amaranth because of herbicide resistance issues. And then, of course, the grasses, as they emerge, they have one single cotyledon leaf, they have very narrow leaves, and the veins tends to be parallel to the midveins. Now, one thing to be careful is not thinking that a sedge is a grass, because they also will have those very narrow leaves, but when you think about management, particularly with herbicides, we need to know whether or not we have a sedge or a grass, because the herbicides that we're going to be picking to control those plants, they're going to be different. And one nice way to separate apart the sedges from the grasses is looking at the stem. So the sedges, if you think about the name, sedge, it's close related to edge, and the stems are triangular shaped. So you just grab the stem and you roll through your fingers at the triangular shape. And two of the most problematic and commonly found in our fields are the purple and yellow nut sedge. And one way to separate them apart is, of course, if they are older and mature enough, you can look at the seed heads. In general, weed ID is always easier when we can see the inflorescence or the flowers or the seed head. But when you think in terms of management, that's not ideally, because ideally we want to control those weeds before they set up seeds for two reasons. Most of the times it's going to be easier to control small plants, and we want to avoid as much as we can seed production, because We don't want the seeds we don't want our soil seed bank being replenished by seeds. And there is other ways to separate them apart with the tubers, but I will show some pictures in a few slides. So the other important way to classify weeds is think about their life history traits. So we think about weeds as annual weeds, biennial weeds, and perennial weeds. So basically, annual weeds, they will germinate, emerge, and complete their life cycle in 1 full year. So, and then we have the summer annuals and the winter annuals. So basically, that's important because if we know that most of our weeds are annual weeds, we can have a very good idea when they are germinating. That will tell us, when is the best time to be employing our control methods that we decide to use. And think about annual weeds. It's all about avoiding or making sure to not letting those plants to produce seeds. Because most weed species, that will depends on the weed species, but for example, pigweed species, Palmer amaranth, the longevity of the seed in the soil is in general 5 to 6 years. So if we can 5 to 6 years in a row have an effective weed management and not let those plants to set up seeds, we are, every year we are decreasing the pressure of those plants in our area, and the necessity to use, very drastic weed management so the management will get easier as the years go by, as long as we are always make sure we are not allowing plants to produce seeds. In some cases, that means that we will have to go there and hand weed weeds. I know that it's never an ideal scenario, but that's why also, very good point that Russ made at the beginning, when you think about pest IPM and, pest thresholds in terms of management for insects, it's very straightforward. You do your sweeps, and you only will start putting, insecticides or control options when you achieve that threshold, and it justifies you you employ those pesticides. But in case of weeds, every plant that we are leaving the field, we are not only impact the crop in that year, but we are, we are impacting the production of future years. So it's really it's a zero threshold. We need to do everything we can to control most of the weeds with ways that are easier, but at the end of mid to late season, if we still have weeds that escape it, we should consider. Of course, it's expensive in labor, it's shortage, but we should maybe even consider some hand weeding. But the goal is to avoid seed production. And just a few examples of weeds in those different classes. Very common summer annual weed species, so they will germinate in the spring, produce seeds by late summer, early fall, and they will naturally die in the fall. So some of the common ones in Arizona so far that I think I have noticed or I have been told would be the pigweed species, the sacred datura, ginseng weed, common cockleburr, ragweed species, and then winter annual. Most commonly probably in our winter vegetable crops, alfalfa that is planted in the fall. They will germinate in the fall, late winter. They will set seeds by early spring, and then they will die late spring or summer. Some of the most common ones that I would say would be henbit, shepherd's purse, chickweed, and annual bluegrass. So the other class of weeds that we have when think about the life traits would be the biennial plants. So that's a little bit more uncommon, and that basically means that they will complete their life cycle in 2 years. So a little bit different than the annuals. The first year they will not produce any seed. They will mostly grow rosettes and make sure that they are storing enough carbohydrates and fuel and energy to survive the winter. And then on the following year they will set seeds and die. Just a few examples. Very, very tough and problematic weeds, especially in areas where we don't do a lot of tillage. So orchards, horseweed and haresleeving. Very, very tough to control, and already not only because they are extremely good in producing seeds, and the seeds can travel very long distance. They are very similar to dandelion seeds. They have this structure called pappus that allows them to travel long distance by wind. But we also have issues with herbicide resistance. And then the final group is the one that we call perennial plants. So basically plants that will survive more than 2 years. Some plants, depending on the weed species, it can be 5, 3 years, or it can even be 20 years. And normally the first year of when you have perennial plants, that first year is one of the best opportunities to try to effectively control them, because before they perennize, the first year they are still not kind of they are an animal plant. So they are still, they don't have the vegetative structures that allows them to survive some control measurements, which are normally above ground we call the stolons, very common in Bermuda grass, and below ground we call the tubers or the rhizomes. So here we have again our purple and yellow nutsack, and this is the vegetative reproductive structures that they have. That's why they are perennial plants, that they can survive multiple seasons. And on the right it's yellow nutsack, and here is the purple nutsack. So if you are, you don't know exactly which set you have, you are trying to identify between the purple and yellow, and you don't have a inflorescence to look at. If you dig out the tubers, the yellow nutsack has more rounded and yellow tubers. And then there's a very tough one, silverleaf nightshade. It's the nightshade family in general. They are very problematic and very tough weeds, but this one particularly is very difficult to control because it is perennial. It's a perennial one. If you think about eastern black nightshade, it would be an annual one. And so they are from the Malvasia family, and Malvasia genus and Solanaceae family. So that's another reason why they are tough ones, because most of our vegetable crops, tomato for example, is in the same family as this plant. So that basically means that we don't have a lot of herbicide options that will control this and not cause damage to our vegetable crops. And again, just another ramification about the perennial plants, we can have the herbaceous ones and the woody ones. So basically, herbaceous means they lack woody stems. So that's probably the most common ones. Field bindweed, another super tough to control weed, very deep root system with the rhizomes, Russian knapweed, Bermuda grass, purple and yellow nutsack, and then our woody perennials, which are basically our shrubs and small trees, poison ivy and Virginia creeper, for example. So I think I was a little bit ahead of myself. I already addressed a little bit about these two plants, but they are probably, when you think about weed management, some of the difficult to control weed species in Arizona. These are probably, amongst the perennial groups, some of the most tough ones, because we don't have a lot of herbicides that are, highly effective, and they are very good to reproduce from their vegetative structures. And I will show more pictures about field bindweed. So here, it's right here. So field bindweed, if we allow it to get established in a field, it will put very deep root system. And on the top of that, they have these stolons or actually rhizomes that will sprout, and they basically form a mat throughout your field. So, you might kill some spots, but they are at some point, if we allow the field to get completely taken by this plant, it will just resprout because you have this huge mat of connected rhizomes underneath the soil. So that's a little bit about the weed terminology and weeds classification, but I guess the most important question is, why do we care about all of that? Why weeds are problematic? And there are many different reasons, and as you can see here in this picture, it goes much beyond than just think about the issues of weeds in our agricultural fields. We have cases, for example, here in this picture on the upper corner, right corner, it's a vine weed called kudzu, and it can completely take over natural areas and forests. I believe this picture is from Georgia. Weeds can be fuel for wildfires. If you don't take care of weeds on our rights of ways, they can block our view for important signs and maybe cause some accidents. And then, of course, which is the focus of my talk today, all the issues related to crop production. And so the first one, when I think about why I don't want to have weeds present in my cropping systems or in my fields, it's number one is because weeds will compete with our crops for the resources. And that's mainly water, light, nutrients, and space. And so that the crops will not be as productive or as they could, or they will not achieve the full production potential. And research, so weed science, that's a topic that has been very widely studied, and for our major crops, it's very widely known already, and the impact by which the weeds will interfere with our crops depends on a lot of things: the amount of different weed species, the density of the weeds, the time that the weeds emerge in comparison to your crop. But we can say that, in general, it can go from 9% yield loss in sorghum to 60 or more on average in the US on cotton, corn, and soybean. And then if you think about only corn and soybean, two of the most important crops in the US, the estimates are that every year we lose about $40 billion due to weed competition or interference in those crops. So basically what I'm trying to say is that it is very significant, and it is very important to be on top of weed management if you want to effectively have a crop and have a productive yields. The other thing that weeds are detrimental, and we don't want weeds, is that they can interfere with some of the other management practices that we plan to do in our crop, in our field. So for example, maybe one that is a good one to show is that weeds can, impact the efficiency of our harvest, or sometimes you cannot even harvest your crop depending on how much pressure of weed you have in your field. And then the other problem of having weeds, and that means that we should worry about weeds not just in our field, but around our fields and in the nearby areas, because weeds, they can work as carriers and hosts for other pests. For example, diseases, insects, and even ground squirrels and mice. So just a good example, that's somewhat more common for the winter annual weed species. In this case, we have henbit. That's not a very good example, but it has the ability to be a host for soybean cyst nematodes. And that's not, as I say, that it's not a very good example because soybeans are not a major, worry here in Arizona. But for example, some other plants such as common lamb's quarter and the Malvasia species like common mallow and cheeseweed, they can be hosts for fusarium, which is a very important disease in lettuce. So that's another reason why we want to make sure that we don't have weeds not only growing within our crops, but around our crops. And weeds can be hazards for both human and animal health. There are some weeds that you definitely don't want to have around, especially if you're growing alfalfa for hay, or if you have a horse pasture, for example, fiddleneck is poisonous for a horse, and another example would be common groundsel that you definitely don't want to have in your hay field if you are trying to grow alfalfa for hay. And like I mentioned, weeds can also work as fuel for wildfires, and then be another hazard in that way. So I hope that after, my main goal so far was to kind of help you to understand the different types of weeds and the importance of knowing what are the possibilities, and then why weed management is important. But so that brings us to the point that why and how can we properly identify those weeds? So the reason why weed ID is so important is that because it is the first step when you're trying to develop your weed management program. And the reason is that depending on the weed biology, the growth, the life cycle, the time that it will emerge, all those things, all the morphology and biology that we briefly discussed so far, they will have a direct impact on the weed management tools that you're going to choose in order to control them. So just to give you guys one example, let's say if you want to use herbicides to control our problematic weeds. There are herbicides that they will only be effective on the broadleaf weeds. So if you can see this picture here on the top left corner, there is no damage on the grasses, but the broadleaf plant, in this case it was a soybean, I believe, it is dying. And then on the other hand, we are controlling a grass plant in the middle of broadleaf plants. So the first thing that you know is it a broadleaf or is it a grass or is it a seed? So another example on how knowing the plant growth habit will impact mowing. For instance, let's say we're trying to control weeds by mowing, which can be an effective tool. However, the most important thing about mowing is that the weed is to have an upright growth habit. So every time that you're mowing, you are actually cutting out the growth points of those plants that commerce them. So in this case, if the goal was to control this clover and this lawn with mowing, I guess it's a failure because the commerce of the clovers, they are so close to the soil surface that it is not being effective at all in this scenario. And then, on another example, cultivation or tillage, or in this case, the lack of tillage, that's again our friend field bindweed. So those pictures were in Florida, and those were fields that used to be heavily tillage or cultivated, but then they switched to drip irrigation tomato, and the field just stopped to be just shallow cultivations or no cultivations, and then field bindweed became a huge problem. And then on the other hand, sometimes if you're running a tillage implement in a field that is already have all the rhizomes and it is established, and if you don't do that enough to replenish the reserves of the plant, sometimes you can even spread those rhizomes in your area, so it can be even worse. And then timing. That's another thing that is important, very important, particularly if you are trying to control weeds with herbicides. So annual plants, in rule of thumb, you need to get them as soon as you can, so the smaller the better. As the plants get bigger, you are losing efficacy. And then perennial plants, in the case of field bindweed, for example, you want to be spraying late in the fall when they are flowering, and the reason is that, and you want to use systemic herbicides. And what I mean by systemic herbicides is that herbicides that will be applied and they will move throughout the plant, so they will translocate to the growth points, and we want them to translocate to the roots in this case, or the rhizomes. And that normally only happens when they are setting flower, and that would be late fall. Another example why weed is important. So I took this picture in an alfalfa field. So it was a seedling alfalfa that was planted in the fall. So the alfalfa was reaching the 3 to 4 true leaf stage, which is the timing that most of our herbicides are allowed to be applied over the top safely. And so that's the time that you need to go through the field and look at which species that you have, so you will actually know which herbicides to pick. And then, looking by these two weed species, they look very similar. And let's say but the reality is that they are both from the mustard family, but the one on the left is shepherd's purse and the one on the right would be London rocket. So let's say that I was not able to know that I had two different weed species, and I thought that everything that I had was shepherd's purse. And then I decided to apply these particular herbicides. Well, that would be a problem because all the herbicides that I chose, they only suppress shepherd's purse, but they are very effective on London rocket. So if I thought that I had London rocket and I actually had shepherd's purse, I guess it wouldn't be a very good outcome. So again, it's very important to be able to properly ID your weeds, because that's the first step when you are developing your weed management program. Not necessarily choosing your herbicides, because you can control weeds with other weed control methods as well, which I'm going to talk a little bit later. And then, there are lots of things that I could be talking about with ID. There are things that especially for the grasses, they are more difficult to identify. And especially when they are seedlings, you need to look for the presence of hairs on the stems. You need to look at the leaf, and then there is something called ligule, which when you connect the leaf blade to the stem, there is this membrane, and then some plants will have the membrane, some plants will have no ligule, some other grasses will have a membranous ligules. there are so many details that maybe I shouldn't have put that here, and I didn't. I forgot about those details. But what at that stage, which is one of the most important stage with WeedID, is just some WeedID tools that I think they are useful. But again, I guess maybe not only relying on those things, they are helpful, but they should not be relied blindly. Understanding a little bit about plant morphology, what to look in terms of presence or absence of hairs, and those things are very important for proper weed identification. But with that being said, the tools that I want to share with you guys here today is, well, the first thing is that you guys can always take pictures and send to our extension agents and to myself. And I'm going to be giving some very quick tips and advice. If you do want to take a picture and send to us, there are better ways to take the picture that will help us to properly look what we are trying to look at the plants. And I mean, I like these free cell phone apps. They are based on, you know, they are free, but they are, the technology behind might sound a little bit fancy, but it's not that fancy. So basically they use, you know, images and artificial intelligence and logarithms to kind of, the more people take pictures and the more people put the right name on those pictures, the better they get. So basically allows you to, they're free if you have a smartphone, you can take a picture. And I'm not saying that we should trust blindly on that, but in my case, they always help me to point me in the right direction, at least tell me the genus of the plant, and then I go to the books, which I'm also going to give you guys some books reference or suggestions. So I think they are useful, however we should be careful when we use them, not rely blindly. Okay, so let's say some taking pictures, what should we be looking at? So these are two examples of not very good pictures. Let's say this was taken too far and this is too blurry. So if you, what I'm looking for would be something more like this. So I close up to the pictures, a close up to the weed species, and you know, even the more pictures the better actually. So not just a close up to the entire plant, but why not a nice close up to the leaf itself? So needs to be a close up, folks. It's always better, you know, if you can take more than one pictures in different parts of the plant. If the plant has flowers, that's one of the easiest ways to identify weeds, is looking at the seed heads. And also providing some information. Do they have a particular smell? How do they feel when you grab them? Is it very hairy? Where was the siding that you found them? Was it like a super shaded environment, super dry? Was near the irrigation, at the irrigation ditch or canal? All those things, they are very helpful when we are trying to look at a picture in identifying the plant. And then back to the iPhone apps. So there are 3 free iPhone apps that I like to use. It's called WeedID, PlantNet, and iNaturalist. So basically how they work, you just take a, that's again back to that same alfalfa field, and that's another weed species that was there. I took a picture and I say, well, I guess I will test. That's the time, that's when I need to know. That's the time that I'm planning to control the weeds. Let's see how those guys will perform. So the first one for the PlantNet, I took the picture, and then all you need to do is to kind of say, oh, am I looking at to the leaf, to the flower, to the bark, to the fruit? So basically, just like very simple, we were looking to the leaf of the plant, and then might be just a coincidence for this, and this is a very common one. So I guess, a little bit skeptical about that, but the very first one that the app suggested me was the right one, which was the common name here is a little bit different. It's called Old Mean in the spring, but that's the common groundsel, the one that we were talking later, which, by the way, is very good to know that you have, because again, that's a poisonous weed. But what I would do if it wasn't like super good as in this case, I would say, oh, might not be this particular weed species, but there is a very good chance that it's the Asteraceae family. So that's those type of things that I think the app might be helpful. Sometimes it will not give you the specific weed species, but it will definitely kind of put you in the right direction, give you some north when you open the book with 400 pages you know, maybe I will just focus on this plant family instead of going through all the pictures in that book. That's the other one, another free app, and the same thing, it was very good. He told me, oh, we are pretty sure that's probably in the Asteraceae, or Asteraceae family, or the Asteroideae subfamily. But I was mainly interested in let's see the family, and then common groundsel. It was right as well. But, like I said, I guess it's always important to go back to the traditional old ways, and that's what I would do if you guys send me a picture. I would, if I don't know, if I have never seen, that's the Weeds of California and other western states from Joseph Di Tommasio. Those are probably one of the best books that you guys should have in terms of, trying to know about, learning more about weeds and weed ID. It's very like good in terms of pictures, details. It will tell you about the growth, things that we discussed, about life cycle, when that normally germinates, when that normally flowers. Very good books. And then help, because I was trying to say me and our indexation agents, you guys can always just take this picture and send it to us. We will always be more than happy to help you guys. So in this case, that's the needle, oh man, I forgot already, but that's the goose foot and the burning needle. And by the way, that's one that is becoming it's becoming more and more of a problem, because it's not a resistance case. This plant has a natural tolerance to glyphosate. And there is a difference about a plant that we selected for resistance and a plant that has always been tolerant. So the main difference is that in this case, this plant was never supposed to be controlled very well with glyphosate or Roundup or all the other different glyphosate products. But if you keep using glyphosate every year, we are killing all the weeds that are successful, and we are leaving behind the ones that are naturally tolerant and the few biotypes that might have the resistance trait. So this plant after a couple of years become the dominant plant there. But it's not because the herbicides provided a mutation on the plant and they became super weeds and now they are resistant. They were always not very well controlled by that chemical. And because we only use the same, we always kill the ones that are supposed to die, keep the ones that are not supposed to die, and they keep increasing their density in the area. And then that's what we call weed shifts. We are shifting a community of plants to another community with less weed species that are harder to control if we keep using the same tools. Okay, cool. So I guess now I just would like to shift gears for finally talking a little bit about weed management and what are the options that we have for control. So there are many different weed management strategies, and one should always think about using them in integrated fashion. But the first and probably one of the most efficient ways that I even did not put in my slide is prevention. So I guess what I'm trying to say is one of the best things that we can do is do things that will avoid the plant to get in our field to begin with. And what I mean by that is not allowing the weeds to set growing around your fields in your non-crop areas, so your irrigation canals, deep banks, make sure to control those weeds there before they set seeds. And then also cleaning machinery. If you go through a field that is highly infested and you see weeds with rhizomes and weeds with seeds, and you just run your cultivator, try to clean that cultivator before moving to another field where the weeds are not as bad. It will really, down the road, it will really save you a lot of time and money trying to kill those weeds later, which is always going to be harder. And then with that being said, monitoring, it's a very important thing to do. And what I mean by that is make sure to keep records. And always let's say, oh, what are the fields that I have issues this year? What are the weed species that I'm seeing there? What was the size of those plants when I actually tried to control them? Oh, let's compare this to the previous year. What's happening here? Oh, 3 years ago, I did not even have horseweed in my list of weeds, and now horseweed and those silverleaf nightshades, they are taking over of my orchard. So what's going on? What can I do differently? What are the herbicides that I have been using? Have I been using always the same ones? When was the time of the year that I was applying them? Was it the best time to do it? So all those type of things, I think it's important. In my opinion, they are worth the extra work. And then crop rotation. That's I believe it's a very important weed management strategy to keep in mind and to do as much as we can. The main reason crop rotation is beneficial and is important is that because that gives us an opportunity to expose our weeds to different management tools. So for example, there are some herbicides that are not labeled for the crops that I have been growing, but if I put a different crop in rotation, I can actually use herbicides that are much more effective on that weed. One example is, for example, rotating, let's say, cotton with silage corn. We have many herbicides that are very effective in controlling the pigweed species, Palmer amaranth, for example, in corn. But then glyphosate and herbicide-resistant Palmer in cotton, it's much more challenging to control than in corn. Other things that crop rotation provides us, depending on the crop, we can, let's say, we are growing a summer annual crop and then we're leaving fallow during the winter. If we can put some cover crop in the winter or some winter vegetable crop there, now we have kind of cover throughout the year. So maybe we are going to be not as bad, winter weeds problems. And we are doing different things at different times of harvest, maybe different cultivation times. So crop rotation, if possible, is always going to be beneficial and it's always going to help with long-term integrated weed management. One example here that I have for you guys is that in North Carolina, soybean. So these two fields here, they were soybean in 2000. This is soybean in 2009. But then 1 year before, the field on the top was soybean, so no crop rotation. And 1 year before, this part of the field was tobacco. So basically, for the field that had soybeans 2 years in a row, you cannot even see the soybean here. It's completely taken over for glyphosate-resistant pigweed, Palmer pigweed. But the areas where they actually had tobacco 1 year before, because they were able to use different chemistries in that field, it was much better. And you can actually see a nice soybean crop. So that's the benefits of crop rotation. You can help you to put decrease the selection pressure and use a more diversified approach, especially herbicide wise. And then tillage cultivation, or what some people, or another way to classify this is our physical weed control. So we can use certain implements or field cultivators and plows and discs to actually physically remove the vegetation that is in a field. This is one example, and then tillage is not only an effective way to control weeds in the furrows or in between the rows, but we do have machinery and a capability of using those physical weed control methods to even control weeds in the seeding line. That's one example of a camera-guided field cultivator. It's called the finger weeder in cotton, which could very well, and I guess most people actually use for in vegetable crops. But those type of weed control methods, can be effective not only in killing the weeds above the ground, but they will also definitely have an impact on how the weeds, are going to be located in the soil profile. That's one old experiment that just showed those different type of tillage systems, the deep tillage with the moldboard plow, and then the chisel plow and low tillage, and just showing you guys where the majority of these weed seeds would be located after each one of those tillage events. So if we're talking about, let's say, our problematic weeds, they only emerge when they are very shallow in the soil profile, which is most of the weeds, especially the annual ones. And they do require a lot of light in high temperature to germinate and emerge. So if that's the case, if we can, I'm not saying to do that every year, but if you can then, do some more the deep tillage, the moldboard plow, once every 3 to 4 years, and start putting all those wheat seeds a little bit deeper in the soil profile, that will help us tremendously in managing those weeds, because basically most of them will not germinate. As compared to, in this case, no tillage at all, where 99% of the seeds were still in that 0 to 2 inch and most likely readily are available for germination and emergence. So again, just a picture showing how, changing where the seeds are located in the soil profile, how that will impact the ones that will actually emerge. So if we have the majority of our weed seeds very near the soil surface, we're going to have more that are going to emerge, and then we're going to have more weeds that are going to have to worry with post-emergence control. Whereas where we do have the option to put those seeds a little bit deeper in the soil profile, most likely for those particular species that are only germinating in the soil profile, it's going to be much easier to deal with than post-emergence. And again, our friend field bindweed, that's just an example that I told you guys, another example on how the weed characteristics and life cycle and morphology will impact the way we manage, or the challenge in managing. That's the tomato field that used to be very often and heavily cultivated in a lot of tillage, and then they put the drip irrigation in tomato, and then they only were doing shallow cultivations, and the shallow cultivations, they were not replenishing all those vegetative root structures. They were just spreading them around, and after a couple of years, they had to plow this field over and completely lost, was not able to have any tomato production at all. And again, the hand weeding, I know that hand weeding is it's not a nice thing to think about, and it's extremely expensive, it's low, labor intensive, we have issues with labor shortage, but if possible, it's going to be helping you tremendously in the following years. It's all about preventing seed bank, replenishment. And then I guess finally, herbicides. Probably, herbicides are for sure one of the most widely used and a critical component of weed control, weed management. There is there is no problems at all with using herbicides. It is just one of the many tools that we have that we should use in our weed management. And when you think about pesticide use in general, comparing to all the other pesticides that we can use, fungicides, insecticides, herbicides actually are the ones that are most widely used. And this graph is just showing us that the green area here is the amount of herbicide used throughout the years, and then the other colors are the other pesticides. So we can see that for crop production, herbicides are the most widely used. And there are some very good reasons for that. Well, the number ones that herbicides are most often the most cheap one, the cheapest one, the most effective one, and readily available. Not as much this year. We are having serious issues with herbicide shortage, especially glyphosate, one of the most widely herbicides in the world. It is now this year 4 times more expensive than it used to be. Many different reasons for that: the pandemic, issues with the plants that produce the compounds. Some machines broke and they were not able to get the parts for replacement, and then on the top of that, the pandemic and the war. But just want to say that herbicides, they are a very important tool for affordable and effective crop production. And this paper is a little bit old, but basically it was saying that the use of herbicides saved for U.S. farmers about 340 million gallons of fuel, just because they don't need to go to the field as often. And in terms of if they don't have the option to use herbicides, they would have to employ more than 7 million agricultural workers for some of those labor activities. But herbicides are also very tricky, and there are very important things that we should know if you do want to use them. So the first thing is, well, what is a herbicide? I guess that's basically it's one of the many pesticides that we have, but particularly means that we are trying, it is used to control unwanted plants, so weeds. And before the 1940s, or before the era where the synthetic herbicides were developed, people used to use other ways to kill weeds. And actually, I didn't put it here, but I think I remember when I took my first weed science class, one of the things people used to do, the very first thing, they used to use human blood to try to kill weeds. We are much more developed than that nowadays, but before the the discovery of the synthetic herbicides, it was very common to use things like sodium, arsenate, copper sulfate, lime. But since 1940s now we have more than 300 different herbicide compounds. The first one that was developed was 2,4-D, and now herbicides are definitely one of the cornerstones of weed management in any crop that we have. But herbicides are not all created equal. They are very, they require a lot of knowledge in terms of which one I should use. They might differ in terms of the time of applications. We have herbicides that we call them pre-emergent herbicides. That basically means they will kill the weeds before they emerge. So I'm not saying that we're killing the seeds. We are killing the weeds as they emerge. So the seeds will still germinate, but as they go across that herbicide layer on the top of the soil, that's when we are going to kill them. We have another group of herbicides that we call post-emergence. So now it's the opposite. We are killing, if we are using post-emergent herbicides, we are going after the weeds that have already emerged, so post-emergence. And also we have things that we call pre-plant or PPI, pre-plant incorporated herbicide. Very popular ones are the yellow herbicides we call the trifuralin or pendimethalin, Prowl or Treflan. So those are also in the pre-emergence group. They will kill the weeds after germination, but as they emerge. And also herbicides might be different in terms of placement. So we have our foliar applied herbicides and soil applied herbicides. And the way that this is a little bit different than this is because the classification can overlap. I can have a foliar applied herbicide that will also have pre-emergence activity. Well, soil applied herbicides, they will not have a post-emergence activity. And then also herbicides will change in their selectivity. So like I briefly said in the past, we have herbicides that will kill only broadleaf plants. We have herbicides that will kill only grasses, and we have herbicides that we call them non-selective, like glyphosate. They will kill all plants, even your crops if they are not, transgenic. They have not been, the genetic modified to be able to tolerate glyphosate. So pre-emergent soil applied herbicides, we're going to apply them before emergence. Post-emergence foliar applied herbicides. They will be having activity on the leaves most of the times, and we are using them post-emergence. So if I want to use a pre-emergence herbicide, what is one of the most important things that I need to know? Well, when are the germination windows of that plant, so I can actually time this application properly. And then post-emergence as well. When are the best times of the year? That's also why scouting is important, that I can go and use my post-emergence herbicide at the proper time. And what I mean by proper time, we need to look at the labels and see, is there any recommendations in terms of the weed size that I should be using? Most of the times the label will say, use this rate for the weeds that are at or below 3 inch height, or if the weeds are above 6 inches, use this rate, or if weeds are above 8 inches tall, this herbicide will not be effective. It might be only to suppress a little bit the plant. So just like a briefly summary again about if you plan to use herbicides, There are a couple of things that are important to know. They are not all created equal. They are very specific in terms of their use. Some are only post-emergent. Will have only post-emergent activity. Some will have only soil-applied residual activity. Some will have both, and they will not, work equally across all weed species. There are different, herbicides for different weed species. But of course, life always finds a way. So that's a problem, because of all those benefits that I told you guys about herbicide use. What happened was we have been overusing in, putting a lot of reliance on our herbicides. And what happened was basically herbicide resistance. We have been selecting our herbicide resistant plants. And that's a problem not only in the US, that's a problem in the entire world. Even though the US is leading the herbicide resistant race right now, it is an issue that is happening everywhere. The amount of weed species that are showing resistance are increasing every year. And not only that, we have some weed species that have resistance to 4 or more different herbicide sites of action. So that's a huge problem. And the main reason why I care about herbicide resistance is that there are many problems, but one of the biggest problems is that we are going to be losing tools that are effective. And if you keep doing that in a rate where we now have plants that are resistant to 4 or 5 different herbicides, it's going to get to a point that we're not going to have any effective option. We're going to have to give up of that field or go fallow for a couple of years. So I guess the take-home message is that herbicides are very effective, should be part of your herbicide program, but we should not abuse our herbicide. So what I mean by that is that we should always think about diversity. We need to have as many different effective sites of action as we have. We need to have different weed control tools at the same time. The ones that I showed, how can I put some physical weed control? Can I have some crop rotation? And then again, how can I decrease the selection pressure in our herbicide? So that means not using the same herbicide year after year. So this is just another way to show you guys the importance of how problematic it is if we start losing our chemistries. I just want to tell you guys, so this is the chronological discovery of new herbicides. So basically, I just want to show that the last time that we actually had a true new herbicide was in the 1980s, more than 20 years ago. That's when we actually have, that's a brand new chemistry. That's a herbicide that is completely different than everything that we have done so far. So that means that, if we keep losing chemistries, we're not we're gonna come up with a new one in a few years. No, it's very hard to come around. It takes 10 to 15 years to do herbicide discovery work, more than $300 million. So we really should do as much as we can to keep the ones that we have still effective. And that's, again, one of the best ways to do those things is to keep in mind to have an integrated weed management approach, try to be proactive. So we should try to do all those things before we have a herbicide-resistant dominance in our field and not after. And finally, how much time I have? Good? Okay. And finally, guys, I'm almost done. I just want to very briefly talk about what about organic herbicides. So everything that I have been talking about is synthetic herbicides and other ways of control weeds, but we do have some organic herbicides. And they do have some advantages and disadvantages, in my opinion. Some of the advantages that I see is that they are very good in terms of think about the environmental sustainability, if you will. They will break very rapidly in the environment. They generally have no residue, so that's good and bad. That means that if I spray a organic herbicide, that I should not have any issue with future things that I want to do in the area. Think about planting new stuff, but at the same time, I'm not controlling the weeds as they emerge for the soil residual activity. And most of them have very low toxicity to people and animals. However, there is a caveat in that. That doesn't mean that organic herbicides are completely safe. So some of the disadvantages, they are very expensive. maybe up to 10 times more expensive than some of the other herbicides that we can find, in our Home Depot or those stores. And, I don't know why, maybe because they are based on some, oils and soaps and acids herbicides. Sometimes, the same products, they will not be as effective as they should be. And then again, the misconception that herbicides are organic are not dangerous. Just to provide you guys a few examples, these are some of our organic herbicide options, and then they have the signal word in the bottles, and some of them have danger in that. So that means that they are, you should be very careful when you are handling and applying them, and follow the label for all the PPI, the personal protection equipment. And some of our synthetic herbicides, they don't have danger there. So you gotta be careful. Just because it's organic doesn't mean that it is completely safe, and you should not be aware of and follow the label instructions. And by the way, the label is the law. You should always follow the label. And the other thing about those organic herbicides, they tend to be, very contacted herbicides. So what that means is that you will apply the herbicide, and the herbicide will not translocate to the plant. Only the parts of the plant that you actually cover is going to be like burned or killed. So there is a lot of complications with that. Number one, it will not kill perennial plants, because for the perennial ones, we really need something that will translocate to those structures below ground. And they are not very good on grasses neither. So you gotta make sure that you have good coverage. You gotta make sure that you're getting the weeds when they are very small. And if most of your problems are grasses, they might not be a very good option. This is just a picture, in this case, very good control with Exi, one of those organic herbicides. But very tiny weeds, and weeds were not very stressed by the time of application. So, a few things that will probably maybe increase your chances to be successful with those organic herbicides is using very high spray volumes, let's say 70 gallons per acre, whereas with the synthetic herbicides, normally I would use 15 or 20. So really make sure that will help you to get the good coverage that you want. Make sure you get the plants at the right size when they're small. And sometimes, using some, let me see here. Oh yeah, some of those adjuvants or surfactants can help you to improve the performance as well. And we have some options that are organic as well. So that's all I had for you guys. I hope that was somewhat useful. I'm glad you tried to, maybe now we have a break to discuss things further and try to answer any questions. And if you guys don't mind, and that's something that I put together. If you have a smartphone, all you need to do is to open the camera of your smartphone, point here, something will appear on your screen, you touch that thing, and then it will take you to a survey. It's just 9 questions, all multiple questions, so you don't need to write anything, just choose the right square. Should take me 5 minutes, and that will help me to better understand what are some of the most common weed species that you have, some of the weed management practices that you do. And when I put this together, it was more focused for cotton and alfalfa and corn. And if you don't happen to grow any of those crops, just skip all the questions that would be related to the management for those crops. And my feelings will not be hurt if you just don't want to do it all. I just, if you have the chance, that would be very helpful. So, thank you very much.